Well, hey everyone, I wanted to make a video just going over how we manipulate and customize our multi-tracks for use during our worship services. Basically, we get our tracks from either Loop Community or multitracks.com, and then we just change them a little bit and add our own click and our own guide to make sure that that click sound and that guide are consistent across every song. And then also sometimes we will edit the song's beginning and end in order to fit into our services properly. So I'm just going to go over how to do that here. I'm going to be talking a lot about different things inside of Ableton Live. This is a program that we're using to play back all of our tracks and also to edit them. If there's something that you don't understand, just jot it down and look it up later. But this video assumes that you have a certain amount of information, so you can look that up at a different time, but I'm just going to jump right into it. The first thing you'll notice, I'm using a template. I have this template put together. This is how I start all of our live sets for our weekend services, and also for any of our tracks that we're making. And this template is really nice because it has a number of things just built in. I've got MIDI mapping already set up. I've got key mapping set up. And I also have a number of effects like peak limiters, and different MIDI instruments for our clicks and our guides, as well as some effects like delay and reverb on our pad, sound, and then also a bunch of our outputs are already set. These are kind of our bus outputs for different things. I'll go over those more in another video. So I start with this template, and this really gets me going where I need to go. It's set up to be controlled by our triggers. And the first thing I want to do when I'm creating any new track is I want to file save as, always, because I don't want to save over my live template. I want to do file save live set as, and then this is where I get into my organization, right? I store all of my tracks on an external hard drive. And organization with multi-tracks is really important, specifically because you don't want to misplace them. There's so many songs that have the same name and are done by different people or similar names, and it can get really confusing. So I'm going to be working on the song Ever Be by Bethel, and you can see that I have a folder where I keep all the originals, and those folders are named by the name of the song, the arrangement of the song, people who did it, the tempo, and then whether it's a multi-track or a custom mix. And so I'm going to start with that same information. This is the original, but I'm going to work on a modified version of it, right? So I'm going to create a new folder and just name it Ever Be. It's by Bethel. It's 69 beats per minute, and it is a multi-track. So now I've got a folder where I can put all of these tracks, and a folder is nice because let's say you have multiple versions of a song. Maybe you have multiple different keys. For example, I have a bunch of different keys set up for the song Christ is Enough here. So if you had multiple keys set up or different arrangements, one with a long ending or a short ending, they could all be under the same folder instead of you having multiple instances of Ever Be just cluttering up one central folder. So organizing by the artist and then specifically the song with the pertinent information you need. And then I'm going to name this one Ever Be. It's just a standard Bethel arrangement, 69 beats per minute. It is a multi-track, and I'm also going to add the key to this one because this is the actual name of the live set, and this live set is going to be in the key of D, which is the original recording key. So now that I've got that set up, I need to import my tracks, and I need to get Ableton set up to do what I want it to do. I tend to use the arrangement view to manipulate our tracks, and you'll see why that's a bit easier in a moment. Session view is easier for playback for our purposes, and arrangement view is easier to edit, and then I just copy them over to arrangement. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that my live set is set to 69 beats per minute so that the grid lines up with the tempo of the song. And then I'm going to import my originals. Like I said, I purchased these multi-tracks from multitracks.com, and I am going to import their multitrack, their live set, into my live set, and that will bring all the different volumes and color coordination and track labeling. It's really helpful. So I'm just going to drag this in here and import it, and it will create, as you can see, just a bunch of new channels. And then I'm going to group those channels together, and that way I know I've got my group for my click and my guide, my group for my output, and I'm going to have a group Command G for Everbee, and I'm going to name it all the pertinent information so I can copy and paste it later. This is Everbee. It's 69 beats per minute, and it's 4/4. Great. So if that information were in one of my scenes, which it will be later, it's going to make my life a lot easier. I can just copy and paste it in. So start with our tracks here. Essentially what we want to do is, they've got their own little click sound in here. You can hear it. Right? It's not a bad click sound. But it can get lost in a mix pretty easily, that like woodblock sound. So we replace it with something that's a bit more, it cuts through the mix a bit more. And I have a track for that up here. I actually have two tracks. One is set to have subdivisions of eighths on, and the other one is set to have subdivisions of eighths off. I realized that you could just move this little knob here, and that would turn them on and off. But it is just easier to move them back and forth, especially when you're working with multiple songs. And that'll make more sense later on as we put a set together. But so I want to add a MIDI click to this track and replace this click here. But in order to make sure that my MIDI click lines up with this song, I have to make sure that this song lines up with the grid of Ableton. So the first thing that I want to do, I want to open up all of these tracks. I want to select them all, and then I just shift clicked all of them. And then when I double click, it'll open up my clip view down here. None of them are warped currently, so I want to warp them, and then I want to change my warp mode to complex. Seems to be the best all around. You can modify it if you'd like, but since I clicked on the click track last of all of these, then the click track is what shows up here in my clip view. And if I look at this, if I zoom in, you can see that the click is from them. This is audio, not MIDI, so their audio of the click is just off of Ableton's grid, which would be fine if I were just playing it back. But since I want to add my own MIDI click, I have to make sure that this song, their click, and the entire song lines up perfectly with the grid of Ableton. This is an M4A instead of a WAV file, so that means that there's a little bit of space at the beginning of the song. So if I just take the whole song and move it over a little bit, it should line up perfectly. And I can do that using warp markers. Again, if you don't know what a warp marker is, look into that. Warp markers let you kind of move things around. So I'm going to insert a warp marker, get rid of their original one. I'm still selected. You can see 12 clips selected. So when I make these modifications, it's going to modify all 12 clips. And I'm just going to drag this first click sound over to the first point of the grid, and now everything should be perfectly lined up. I get a little anal with this stuff, so I tend to, kind of move everything around, make probably too many warp markers that I don't need to make. But hey, better safe than sorry. So a few warp markers at the beginning, and then essentially what I want to do is just make sure that all of these clicks are perfectly lined up with the grid. I can see they don't wave at all. Sometimes with elevation songs they'll speed up and slow down, so keep an eye out for that. But it looks like Bethel did a good job and just kept everything perfectly on the grid. So I'll put some warp markers at the end, and then one at the very end of the song for good measure. So now what all of these warp markers will do for me is they'll make sure that not only is everything perfectly lined up to the grid, but if I were to speed the song up or slow the song down, it would stretch it appropriately. So the song is now perfectly lined up to the grid, which means that when I turn on Ableton's click, it should line up perfectly with Multitracks click. Right? So perfect. So it's perfectly lined up. Now I can add my MIDI click and get rid of theirs. My MIDI click is actually, it's just Ableton's click track sound, but sort of on steroids a little bit. And I have that, right, this is a MIDI instrument that's just looking for MIDI hits, accents, fourths, eighths, all that stuff. So I have basically a MIDI little track, a little MIDI loop. This is all from multitracks.com, by the way. It's their Foundations instrument. And they give you a bunch of these little clips at different subdivisions with count-ins and you know, different time signatures that you can just pull in. They're just MIDI beats. It's very simple. And if I pull this in here, I can just drag it to loop it, and now I've got a click.
3, 4.
Right, so you can hear that, hopefully. It's pretty loud. And that really cuts through a mix really well, which is good because it's much easier to hear than this woodblock sound. So I'm just going to turn that off, and then I'm going to extend my click all the way out past the end of the song. When we put this into session view, this is going to loop indefinitely, right? So rather than creating one finite click sound, it's looping indefinitely. So even though the tracks end, the click will keep going, which is nice if you want to reprise something. I like Multitracks color scheme, so I'm going to make this white to match their click. I'm also going to add my own guide, right? They have their own guide, which is great.
1, 2,
right?
1.
The nice lady that we've all heard.
3, 4.
And there's nothing wrong with their guide, but again, sometimes it's hard to hear, and it's not like we can't manipulate it. So if it says something that's maybe confusing, or maybe I want to subdivide things differently and count differently, or you know, for certain songs that have instrumental portions, sometimes I'll add additional cues. So I basically recreate their entire guide track on our own guide, which is actually, it's from Loop Community, so Loop Community's guide, and add that in as a MIDI instrument as well. So it's our own MIDI click, our own MIDI guide, and we can customize them based on the way we're doing the song, and then I take out theirs. So I'm going to create a clip here. If you press Shift Command M, it just creates a MIDI clip of whatever length you determine, and I'm going to rename it Command R LC Guide, so I know what it is, Loop Community Guide. And if I double click on it, it gives me a little MIDI instrument here that I can edit, right? And you guys have heard this guy before.
1, 2, chorus.
Right? So I basically will recreate their guide and then add a couple modifications of my own. And this is something that's a bit tedious. I'm not going to go through all of this for you because it would take forever. But essentially, you just kind of go one-to-one, adding what you determine to be necessary. So I'm going to play the song. I have the grids of these two set up to match one another, so it's a bit easier to follow along. But if you start from the beginning, I can see their guide and hear their guide, and I just replace it.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.
So it's just a normal count in.
1, 2.
I'm just going to say intro instead of 1.
Intro. 2, 3, 4.
So, again, not a huge difference, but something that's a little nicer.
2. Intro. 2, 3, 4.
And again, I'm just going to keep going on, seeing what they have in here.
Verse. Breakdown.
So I like what they have there. I'm just going to do the same thing.
Verse.
Where's my breakdown?
Breakdown.
And essentially, you just do this, right? You follow along. You add in all the different sounds that you need to. Count-ins, count-outs, breakdown, breaks, all of that stuff. And again, just looking at the very beginning of it, you may be thinking, like, why would you do that? There are some instances, in fact, there are many instances where the guide that they give us just doesn't really communicate all the information that we want to communicate, or maybe in our verbiage. So we make our own just to make sure that our bands understand it. And also, if we're going to change the arrangement a little bit, you know, sometimes they'll say like tag, but we really want it to end. So those are times when having our own guide is really helpful. So basically, when you're done with that, and like I said, I'm not going to go through that whole thing, but when you're done with that, you want to turn off their click and their guide so that it's just our click and our guide.
1, 2. Intro. 2, 3, 4.
Right? Everything's working fine. So I've got our click, I've got our guide in there, I've got all of their tracks lined up with the grid. I'm going to add a pad as well. We just have ambient pads that play under every song. Most of the time, we're going to turn off pretty much all of these tracks, aside from, you know, the ones that we absolutely need at the time. So then you're left with this ambient pad that goes underneath, and we add ambient pads in every key. I've got a folder of them here. This song is in the key of D, so I'm going to pull in an ambient pad in the key of D. And what we do with our ambient pads, we have them set up with some reverb and delay so that they fade in and fade out between songs, right? So this is, if I could solo this, this is what our pads sound like. Hopefully you can hear that. Right? So it's just an ambient pad. We just add some delay and reverb to it so that when it stops, it doesn't just stop like that, but rather it fades in, and when I stop playing, now because of the delay and reverb, it'll fade out. And it makes a nice transition between songs when one pad is fading out and one pad is fading in. So I've got my ambient pad in there. Let me put this back down to correct volume. I've got my ambient pad, I've got my click and my guide. The only other thing that I tend to do with these songs is I'll modify the end of them if I need to. Let's say the track has the band crashing out for a minute and a half, like some Passion songs do. I don't need that in my life. You don't need that in your life, and we don't need that at the end of our songs. So what we will do is go through and listen to the end. So this one just ends, for those of you that know Ever Be. But if it were to crash out, I would want to fade each one of the tracks to remove that fade, to remove that portion of audio. And I don't want to do that in the arrangement view. I want to do that in the clip view down here. Basically just find the end of the track. Again, this assumes that you know some things about envelopes, and putting those in, right, you would just essentially fade things out. I'm not going to do that because I don't need to do that for this song. But essentially you would do that for each individual track and just listen to it over and over again to make sure that the fade is proper, so that our band doesn't have this weird thing happening when we stop playing. And that's essentially it. When all of that is done, I listen to it a few times over to make sure that it sounds appropriate. But then from here, I can take all of this and put it in our session view, copy it or highlight it, hold it, and then I just click tab and it brings me over here, add them in, and now I've got all the tracks here. So when I fire this off,
2, intro, 2, 3, 4.
And that's about it, right? Everything looks pretty. Everything is contained. I've got my own click sound, my own guide sound. I've got our ambient pads. I've got their tracks aligned to the grid. And I've got my fades at the beginning and the end set properly how I want them. And now I should be good to go. And then all of our tracks end up looking like this. So when we put sets together, which I'm going to make another video about here in a moment, they all look like this. So you can just grab all of them and pull them over to session view and make it look nice and pretty. It makes our weekend services much easier, and it makes dealing with data like the tracks much easier as well. So that is about all I can think of. One last thing before I forget, probably the most important thing, right? Saving. Save live set all the time. I didn't do much because I was sitting here training you guys, but Command S should be like your favorite thing when doing something like this. Save all the time. Don't lose your data. And after you save everything, you want to do collect all and save, right? So you remember I pulled in the Multitracks from this folder, but I created a new live set and put it in this folder. Right now there's just Ableton Project Info, but there's no Multitracks. They don't exist in here. This doesn't have any audio. It's rather pulling that audio from the other file, from the other folder, and that's nice when you're just creating duplicates of a live set, but if you want to send this to someone, you need to collect all and save. So after you save, collect all and save, it will basically take all of the loop community guide cues. It'll take the pad in D, your MIDI 4.4, and all of the audio from everywhere that is being used, and it will combine it into the one folder that you need. It takes a moment to copy. It may take a little bit longer since I'm also recording my screen. But you can see those are all of our guides, and then it should capture all of our M4As as well. And then we're good to go. And so now it'll rebuffer these samples, but now you can see the Multitracks and samples are in this file, in my modified file, so that I can easily send this modified live set to someone and they can use it on a weekend. And so that is it. Now officially we've gone over everything that you need to know in order to create, to manipulate our Multitracks for use during our weekend services. There will be another video coming out just of how to make all of these fit into a live set for a weekend service, but that should be about it. Happy tracking.